The white snow was turning red, not from a big battle, but from something much sadder. It was blood from the frozen feet of hungry soldiers. Men walked without shoes on the ice-cold ground. Their bodies were getting thinner every day. Their hope was almost gone. Smoke came from the dying fires. It went up into the dark, cold night. This was the last strength of an army that was falling apart. These were not winning soldiers. These were ghosts of men who had given everything and got nothing back. Standing in the middle of it all was George Washington. He was chosen to lead them, but many people whispered that he was not good enough. The government was thinking about replacing him before the war was even decided. He carried the weight of a whole nation that did not believe in him. He knew that one mistake could end America's dream before it started. Think about it. You have to keep a hungry army together. Politicians argue about whether you should be fired. You have no food, no shoes, no supplies. You don't know if tomorrow will bring anything but more death. Every choice you make affects whether a nation lives or dies. One wrong step could end America's dream. Would you keep going? Would you push through the storms, the hunger, and all the doubts? Or would you give up with everyone else, leaving only blood in the snow to show where you once stood? Before you answer, think about this. It's easy to praise Washington now. Now we have his statue and his picture on money. It's easy to call him Father of America when we already know he won. But back then, he was not a hero. He was a man that people hated, doubted, and made fun of. Even his own people did this. If you were there, would you have believed in him? Or would you have joined the crowd calling for someone new? Would you have followed him? Would you have survived those nights of hunger and fear? Or would you, like many others, have run away in the dark and tried to forget about freedom? We will not talk about Washington the statue. We meet Washington the man, a man who bled, who failed, who doubted himself, but never broke when everyone expected him to. Stay until the end, because if you leave now, if you click away to find something easier, you would be doing exactly what many people did to him in real life. Abandon him when he needed help the most. So stay. Go through this hard journey with him. Prove you would not have walked away. Before George Washington was on money, before he became the father of America, he was just a boy born into a world that promised nothing and was not kind to weak people. When he was 11 years old, death took his father away. The man who was supposed to teach him how to become a man was gone. George and his brothers and sisters had to carry heavy burdens. They were too young for this. All safety was gone. In its place came a hungry feeling that would never leave him. Not hunger for food, but hunger to be important, to be honored, to have a place in a world that seemed ready to forget him. Imagine being that child. No father to protect you. No clear path ahead. Just emptiness. And the desperate hope that through hard work, through never giving up, you might write your name in history before it erases you completely. That emptiness shaped him. That emptiness would drive him for his whole life. Washington grew into a tall, impressive young man. He had broad shoulders and stood up straight. He looked like a leader even before he earned the right to lead. But looks can lie. Under his calm, strong appearance lived a temper that sometimes exploded. He had pride that often wanted more than the world was willing to give. He had big ambitions that sometimes made bad decisions. He was not yet wise. He was not yet careful. He was raw, and in war, raw ambition is dangerous. He looked for his chance in the wilderness. This was where empires fought each other. Britain and France were fighting for control. Young men went there to prove themselves with blood and war. Washington's moment came at a place called Fort Necessity. He was only 22 years old, still more boy than man, but eager, too eager, to prove he was important. The fort was built in a bad place. It was built badly and defended poorly. Washington's men had no experience. His supplies were weak. His defenses were exposed. But his pride pushed him forward. He believed his courage would be bigger than his mistakes. He believed honor could be won just by trying hard. He was wrong. The French forces surrounded them. Rain made their gunpowder wet and useless. The muskets stopped working as soldiers looked for dry powder that didn't exist. Washington watched as his men, scared and outnumbered, began to fail. Mud destroyed their defenses. The enemy came closer. The young commander, who had dreamed of glory for so long, was forced to do the one thing he hated most: give up. The shame burned into him like fire. The reports spread quickly across the colonies. George Washington, the ambitious young man from Virginia, had been crushed. His necessity became a disaster that people whispered about in bars and wrote about in newspapers. What was meant to be the start of his legend became the stain that threatened to end it before it began. Can you imagine the shame? To be 22 years old, dreaming of greatness, and then to see your name dragged through mud in front of the world. To be laughed at, doubted, dismissed. To feel the crushing weight of your own failure pressing down on your chest like a heavy stone. Washington knew it. He felt it every time his name was spoken with hate. And deep inside, the question tore at him. Was his chance already over? And what about you? Have you ever failed so badly that you wondered if your story was finished? Have you ever tasted shame so deep it made you question if you would ever rise again? Washington had. And in that moment, his dream of honor was ashes. But ashes, if you don't give up, can feed the fire that comes later. But Washington was not finished. The colonies still needed men who would fight. Though his pride was hurt, his ambition still burned. He learned from Fort Necessity. He learned the bitter cost of being too proud. But scars don't heal quickly. The young Washington who came out of that defeat was still restless, still got angry easily, still desperately wanted recognition. The shame would follow him into every room, every command, every decision. He would carry it like a wound that never fully healed. Years later, when the Revolution came, Washington's enemies would remember that failure. They would whisper about Fort Necessity when he made mistakes, when battles were lost, when men left his army. They would say, "He failed before. He will fail again." And maybe Washington himself believed it, in the darkest moments when defeat seemed certain. But failure is not the end. It is the teacher. And Washington, flawed as he was, learned. He learned to keep going. He learned humility. And he learned that true honor is not grabbed in one glorious moment. It is built through suffering, through shame, and through getting up again when everyone expects you to stay down. He had wanted glory and found only shame. He had wanted to rise, but fell hard instead. The question now was simple. Would he ever rise again? Or would his story end in the mud of Fort Necessity, a forgotten young soldier who reached too high, too soon? George Washington did not ask to lead a revolution. He was chosen. Some believed he was the right man. Others had doubts. But Washington himself was torn. He knew what was at risk. He knew his weaknesses. He knew that accepting command could end not in glory, but with his death. Picture him in June 1775, standing in front of the Continental Congress. The men argued and got angry. The colonies were divided, but one truth united them. If they did not fight, they would kneel forever under the weight of a king who saw them as servants, not citizens. They needed a commander. All eyes turned to the tall man from Virginia, with the soldier's bearing and quiet dignity that seemed to fill the room. Washington did not jump at the chance. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. Instead, he stood serious, knowing that this was not an honor, it was a burden. He accepted command, not with ambition, but with the heavy knowledge that he was putting his life and his family's future at great risk. From the moment he rode north to take command of the Continental Army outside Boston, the truth hit him harder than any bullet. This was not an army. This was a desperate collection of farmers, shop owners, and working men. They carried muskets older than themselves. Many had no shoes. Few were trained. They had almost no supplies. Their courage was clear, but courage does not feed an army. It does not clothe them or protect them from bullets. Washington looked at his men and knew instantly. This was not enough to win. Not against the most powerful empire on earth. And the doubts began. Not just his own, but those of others. Congress worried. Officers whispered. The British laughed. How could this ragged group stand against red-coated soldiers, who were well-trained and supplied with endless ships, weapons, and money? Washington carried the burden of every doubt, every sneer, every whisper. But he rode among his men with his back straight and his words calm. He knew that if he showed fear even for a moment, the weak spirit of his army would break before the first battle was fought. But the enemy he faced was not only across the battlefield. It was in his own camp. Men began leaving like a disease spreading. They disappeared in the night, going back to their farms and families. Promises of pay were not kept. Supplies that Congress promised to send never came. Washington soldiers, hungry and cold, looked at their commander with eyes that asked one question: "Do you really believe we can survive this?" And Washington, though filled with doubt, could not answer honestly. He swallowed his fear and gave them what they needed most: determination. Not comfort, not easy hope, just determination. The will to stand one more day, to survive one more night, to fight one more battle. But even as he tried to hold the army together, betrayal grew behind him. Some officers hated his strictness. They whispered in letters to Congress, suggesting that maybe another man could lead better. Maybe Washington was too inexperienced, too rigid, too slow to act. These whispers cut deep, because Washington knew how weak his command was. He had no throne to lean on, no crown to protect him. His authority lived only in the faith of his men and the patience of Congress. Lose either, and the revolution would collapse. Can you imagine it? Leading thousands, but never certain if your orders would be followed. Riding into camp each morning, not sure if the men you saw yesterday would still be there. Writing desperate letters for food, for shoes, for gunpowder, and getting silence back. This was not command. This was survival under constant shame. And I ask you, have you ever been given a job so heavy you wondered if you could carry it? Have you ever been put in charge when you knew, deep down, you were not fully ready, when failure seemed not just possible, but certain? Washington lived with that weight every day. He did not show off. He did not brag. He carried it quietly, because if he showed his doubt, the weak hope of a nation would crumble. The summer of 1776 brought disaster. Battles lost. New York burned. Soldiers scattered. The great George Washington, commander of the Continental Army, watched as the cause seemed to fall apart in his hands. Newspapers made fun of him. People loyal to the king called him a traitor. British generals dismissed him as a man already beaten. Even in his own army, officers said quietly that maybe Congress had chosen wrong. Maybe George Washington was not the man to lead them. Maybe the dream of America would end before it really began. And so the question became sharper, just as it had years earlier at Fort Necessity. Would George Washington rise, or would his story end in failure? Would his name be remembered as the man who led America to freedom, or the fool who gambled and lost everything? The choice was no longer only his. It was the choice of his soldiers, of Congress, of tired people who began to wonder if independence was worth the price. And Washington stood at the center of it all, silent, steady, carrying the weight of doubt thicker than the smoke of battle. This was not a commander certain of victory. This was a man crushed under responsibility, tested by betrayal, and haunted by the fear of failure. But he did not walk away. He did not surrender. He kept going. Because sometimes, the difference between history remembering you as a hero or a failure is not brilliance, not genius, not even strength, but refusing to give up when everyone tells you that you already have. The winter of 1777 was not remembered for battles, but for survival. At Valley Forge, Washington's army bled without a single musket being fired. Hunger became their enemy. Disease killed them. Cold was their constant enemy. 6 months in camp, with death creeping through every tent, every bed, every shivering body. These were not soldiers marching proudly to victory. They were skeletons wrapped in rags, each day wondering if they would live to see another sunrise. The British, warm and well-fed in Philadelphia, laughed at them. Congress, far away and divided, sent words instead of food, promises instead of supplies. Washington wrote letter after letter, begging for bread, begging for coats, begging for shoes, and got silence back. He watched as his men boiled leather to make soup. He heard them cough in the night until their lungs gave out. He saw their blood frozen in the snow, marking their slow walk toward graves dug by their own friends. The revolution did not look like victory. It looked like death. But the greatest pain Washington carried was not hunger or cold. It was betrayal. Officers plotted behind his back. Politicians whispered about replacing him. The Conway cabal planned, believing another man should command the army. Imagine that, while his men froze and starved, while he fought to keep the cause alive, his so-called friends worked in shadows to destroy him. Thomas Conway, a French officer who had never missed a meal in his life, wrote poison disguised as criticism. Heaven has been determined to save your country, or a weak general and bad advisers would have ruined it. The words cut deeper than the winter wind. Here was proof of what Washington had always feared, that he was not enough, that the boy who had failed at Fort Necessity was failing again, just more slowly and with higher stakes. Can you imagine reading those words? Can you imagine finding out that while you were losing sleep over your starving soldiers, your supposed friends were losing sleep plotting against you? The loneliness of that betrayal was almost too much to bear. Outside his tent, men were dying for the cause. Inside his tent, Washington was dying a different kind of death, the slow destruction of trust, respect, and hope. But here's what made Washington special. He did not get angry. He did not break. He didn't even defend himself publicly. Instead, he sat down and wrote a letter to Conway, calm, measured, powerful in its dignity. A letter which has lately come to my hands contains words of yours, which predict my ruin. Predict my ruin. Not fight against it. Not argue with it. Just accept it. With the quiet strength of a man who had learned to carry weight without complaining about how heavy it was. This was leadership at its purest, surviving betrayal without becoming bitter, carrying criticism without being crushed by it, keeping dignity when everyone around you has lost theirs. But here's the question. How many of us could have done the same? When friends turn against you, when allies become enemies, when the people you're sacrificing for are plotting your destruction, how do you respond? Do you lash out? Do you quit? Do you let the bitterness poison everything you're fighting for? Most of us would break. Most of us would walk away. Most of us would decide that no cause is worth this kind of suffering, this level of betrayal, this depth of loneliness. Washington stayed, even when staying meant watching his men die, even when staying meant listening to whispers about his ability, even when staying meant carrying a weight that no man should carry alone. Why? What kept him there when every good reason told him to leave? Maybe it was the memory of that 11-year-old boy who had lost everything and promised he would never be powerless again. Maybe it was understanding that if he walked away, every man who had died in the snow would have died for nothing. Maybe it was simply the stubborn refusal to let his enemies, British or American, claim victory over his will. Whatever it was, it held him together when everything else was falling apart. But surviving alone was not enough. The revolution still balanced on the edge of collapse. If Washington could not turn despair into hope, then all the blood spilled in the snow would be for nothing. The question remained, would his men hold together until spring, or would the cause of America freeze to death at Valley Forge? But surviving was only half the battle. The snow outside Washington's tent may have melted, but inside, another storm was forming, one that could have destroyed him without a single musket fired. Christmas Day, 1776. The end of the world, disguised as a holiday. Washington stood on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, watching ice chunks the size of coffins slam into each other in the black water. The wind cut through his coat like knives, and the snow fell so thick it was like trying to breathe underwater. This was not weather for crossing a river. This was weather that killed men just for being foolish enough to try. But foolishness was all they had left. The Continental Army was dying, not from wounds, but from time. Men's contracts would end in 6 days, New Year's Day, 1777. When that happened, they could go home legally, honorably. No one could call them cowards or traitors. They had served their time. They had kept their word. They could leave with their heads high and their hearts clear. And they would leave. Washington knew it with the certainty of a man who had watched too many good intentions crumble under reality's weight. When January 1st came, most of his army would simply disappear. Back to their farms. Back to their families. Back to lives that didn't require them to die for abstract ideas like liberty and independence. He had 6 days to give them a reason to stay. 6 days to change despair into hope. 6 days to pull victory out of what looked like certain defeat. So he gambled everything on one night. One river. One desperate attack against an enemy that believed him already beaten. Victory or death. That was the password for the mission. Not because Washington was being dramatic, but because those were literally the only two choices left. Win this battle, or lose everything. There was no middle ground. No safe retreat. No living to fight another day. Victory or death. The boats were small, rough, designed for carrying supplies, not armies. They sat low in the water under the weight of men and weapons, and every wave that crashed over the sides brought them closer to sinking. Ice formed on everything, the oars, the sides of the boats, the men themselves. Soldiers who had started the crossing with chattering teeth fell silent as their bodies began to shut down from cold. Washington moved among them like a ghost, his huge frame somehow steady despite the chaos around him. He didn't speak much. What was there to say? But his presence was everything. When men looked up and saw him there, sharing the danger, sharing the misery, sharing the terrible uncertainty of whether they would live to see morning, they found strength they didn't know they had. Hours passed. The simple act of crossing a river, something that should have taken minutes in good weather, stretched into a test of survival that killed men without honor, without glory, without anyone even noticing they were gone. Bodies fell into the black water and disappeared, claimed by cold and current and the simple brutality of nature. But still they pushed forward, because turning back was death, staying still was death, and going forward was their only hope of something better than death. When they finally reached the New Jersey shore, dawn was breaking, and Washington's army looked less like soldiers than like survivors of some natural disaster. Men could barely hold their muskets. Feet were frozen solid inside boots that had become instruments of torture. Some soldiers cried openly, not from fear, but from the simple physical pain of being alive in such conditions. And yet they marched, through snow that came up to their knees, across ground so frozen it rang like metal under their feet, toward an enemy that had no idea they were coming. The German garrison at Trenton was warm, comfortable, and completely confident. They had celebrated Christmas with food and drink that Washington's men could only dream of. They had gone to bed secure in knowing that no army could move in such weather, that no commander would be foolish enough to try, that the rebels were finished as a fighting force. They were wrong. The attack was fast, brutal, and complete. German soldiers stumbled from their quarters, confused and terrified, only to find American bayonets waiting for them. Within an hour it was over. Over 900 enemy soldiers captured, weapons and supplies seized. The psychological impact immediate and massive. Not a single American died in the assault. Not one. After months of defeat, after the shame of Valley Forge, after the whispers and betrayals and endless doubts, finally, a victory so complete it seemed like a miracle. But Washington wasn't finished. Days later, he struck again at Princeton, this time placing himself directly in the line of fire, riding among his men as British muskets cracked around him. Smoke swallowed horse and rider. His officers turned away, certain their commander had been killed. When the smoke cleared, there he was, unharmed, untouchable, somehow blessed by whatever gods watch over desperate men doing impossible things. In 10 days, Washington had changed the revolution, from the edge of complete collapse to renewed hope, from whispers of replacement to shouts of praise, from defeat to victory. But here's what made it truly special. It wasn't the victories themselves that mattered. It was what those victories showed about the man who had led them. This wasn't luck. This was an accident. This was what happened when iron will met desperate need, when survival met opportunity, when a man who refused to break finally got the chance to prove that sometimes, just sometimes, refusing to surrender is enough. The war was far from over. Years of struggle still lay ahead. More defeats, more betrayals, more moments when all seemed lost. But after the crossing, after Trenton and Princeton, after Washington proved that miracles were possible for those brave enough to attempt them, everything was different. The question was no longer whether America could win. The question was whether Americans deserved to win. And Washington had given them their answer. Victory has a way of showing character that failure never can. Defeat teaches you what you're made of, but winning shows you what you're willing to become. The war ended as these things do, not with one big final battle, but with a slow understanding that one side no longer had the will to continue. The British, after years of bleeding money and men in a war that was becoming more and more unpopular, finally admitted what Washington had proven through pure stubborn survival, that some things cannot be conquered, only earned. When Lord Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, Washington stood among his officers and felt empty. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just empty. The boy who had lost his father at 11, who had failed at Fort Necessity at 22, who had survived betrayal and starvation and doubt for 8 bloody years, that boy was finally gone, replaced by something harder and more complex. He was now the most powerful man in America. His army loved him. The people worshipped him. Congress, for all their earlier doubts, recognized that without Washington, there would be no United States of America. He had become exactly what that hungry 11-year-old had dreamed of becoming. Someone who mattered. Someone who could never be ignored or forgotten. And that's when the real test began. Because power, real power, is not about taking. It's about letting go. Throughout history, successful military leaders had followed a predictable pattern. When the war, seize control, become the thing they had fought against. Rome's generals became emperors. Revolutionary leaders became dictators. The cycle was so common it was practically a law of nature. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Everyone expected Washington to follow the same path. Some of his officers even suggested it openly. Why not become America's king? Why not take what he had earned through blood and sacrifice? The people would follow him. The army would enforce his will. He could build the nation according to his vision, without the chaos and inefficiency of democratic debate. The temptation must have been enormous. Think about what he had survived. The starvation, the betrayals, the loneliness, the weight of carrying a nation's hopes on shoulders that weren't built for such burdens. After all that suffering, wouldn't he have earned the right to shape America's future according to his will? Wouldn't he have deserved to be more than just another name in history books? But on December 23, 1783, in a simple ceremony in Annapolis, Maryland, George Washington did something that shocked the world. He quit. He handed his command back to Congress, gave up control of the Continental Army, and announced he was going back to private life at Mount Vernon. No demands for power, no conditions for stepping down, no big speeches about his sacrifices or his right to rule. Just resignation. Simple, complete, voluntary surrender of the greatest power in the new nation. King George III, when he heard about it, called it the greatest act in the history of the world. Because kings, emperors, and dictators don't voluntarily give up power. They cling to it, fight for it, die for it. They convince themselves that they alone can save their people, that their continued rule is essential, that stepping down would be a betrayal of their duty. Washington understood something deeper, that true leadership isn't about gathering power, but about knowing when to let it go, that the highest service isn't ruling, but teaching others that no one person should rule, that the greatest victory isn't conquering your enemies, but conquering yourself. This was his masterpiece, not the crossing of the Delaware, not the victory at Yorktown, but the moment when he chose to be less than he could have been, so that America could become more than anyone had imagined. The man who had spent his entire life hungry for recognition, for respect, for a place in history, chose to step back into anonymity. The man who had survived betrayal and doubt and criticism chose to trust his critics with the power he had won through his own suffering. Can you imagine that level of self-control? After everything he had been through, everything he had sacrificed, everything he had earned, to simply walk away, to trust that others would build on the foundation he had laid, even though he knew they would make mistakes, even though he knew they would sometimes fail? Most of us can't. Most of us, if we had suffered what Washington suffered, if we had achieved what he achieved, would want our reward. We would want recognition, power, control, the ability to shape things according to our vision. We would convince ourselves that we had earned it, that we deserved it, that stepping aside would be foolish. Washington chose differently. And in that choice, he revealed the final truth about greatness. It's not about what you can take. It's about what you're willing to give up. George Washington died in his bed at Mount Vernon on December 14, 1799. No fanfare. No final battle. No dramatic last words that would echo through history. Just an old man letting go of breath the same way he had let go of power, quietly, with dignity, without complaint. He had lived long enough to see the Constitution written, the new government established, the rules set that would guide America for centuries. He had served as the first president, establishing the traditions and limitations that would define the job. He had proven that a republic could work, that people could govern themselves, that power could be transferred peacefully. But that's not why he matters. George Washington matters because he was a man who refused to break. Not because he was perfect, he wasn't. Not because he never failed. He did, repeatedly and publicly. Not because he was born to greatness. He was born to nothing, and death stole even that little before he was grown. Washington matters because when the world told him he was finished, he kept going. When his own allies betrayed him, he kept going. When his men were dying and his cause seemed lost, he kept going. When victory finally came and everyone expected him to claim his reward, he survived the greatest temptation of all, the temptation to become what he had fought against. He kept going, not with superhuman strength, not with divine help, not with any special gifts that aren't available to every person who draws breath. He kept going with ordinary human will, applied consistently, over time, in the face of extraordinary pressure. And that's the lesson. That's why his story still matters. Why it still has the power to inspire or shame or challenge anyone who hears it. Because Washington proved that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, not through brilliance or luck or divine favor, but through the simple, difficult, unglamorous act of refusing to quit. Every day, you face the same choice Washington faced. Maybe not on the scale of a nation's survival, but the choice is the same. Keep going or quit. Push forward or give up. Rise to the challenge or surrender to the difficulty. The easy thing is to quit, to walk away when things get hard, when people doubt you, when the path ahead looks impossible, to abandon the cause when the cause isn't appreciating your sacrifice, to click away from stories that challenge you, to avoid situations that test you, to choose comfort over growth every time the choice comes up. Washington chose differently. Over and over, for decades, he chose to keep going. And in doing so, he proved that persistence, not genius, not luck, not even courage, is the foundation of everything worth building. So the question isn't whether you admire George Washington. The question is whether you're willing to learn from him, whether you're willing to keep going when it seems pointless, whether you're willing to stay when everyone else is leaving, whether you're willing to carry the weight without complaining about how heavy it is. Because if you are, if you can find in yourself even a fraction of Washington's stubborn refusal to break, then you already have everything you need to build something extraordinary. The boy who lost his father became the father of a nation. The young man who failed at Fort Necessity became the commander who never surrendered. The general who could have been king became the citizen who walked away from power. George Washington was not born a legend. He was born a man who kept going. And that simple, difficult, extraordinary choice to keep going when everything tells you to stop, that is why a nation still stands. That is why his story still matters. That is why you're still here, feeling the weight of your own challenges, wondering if you have what it takes to keep going. You do. Washington proved it's possible. The only question is whether you'll prove it's possible for you.